Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Just as everyone's starting to drift in, we'll give everyone a couple of minutes just to make sure that they are connected and their sound's connected and everything's working okay. If in this meantime you're able just to change your name on Zoom, so that means that we know who's asking questions. If that's something you're going to do, that would be great. So we're at 80 already, which is fantastic to see. So yeah, for those that are just joining, welcome. This is Regen's Regional Energy Strategic Plans Policy Framework webinar. So yeah, we're just going to give it another minute or two as people drift in. And if in that period you're able to change your Zoom name to your actual name, and if you can, add your organisation, but if not, there's no worries. Great. So again, I think final time and then I'll dive in. Just to say a really quick hi and welcome to Regen's Regional Energy Strategic Plans webinar event. And thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Just as the last kind of few drift in, if your Zoom name reflects your actual name, that would be really handy later on when it comes to the question side of this session. So with that, I will kick off. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to this event. My name is Molly Atherton, and if you received an earlier agenda for this webinar, you may have seen a slightly different job title on there, which suggested I was an all-round good egg at Regen, which, while being objectively true, isn't actually my job role. So I am the local energy and local authority lead at Regen. I work across a lot of our work with local authorities and local government across the energy system, and have been kind of really quite involved in understanding the regional energy strategic plans framework from a local authority perspective for the past 12, 18 months. So if we just jump onto the next slide, please, Hannah. Thank you. So a little bit about Regen before we dive into the content of today's session. Regen has a mission to transform the UK's energy system, really focusing on the experts, pioneers and conveners that help do this, really focusing on some of the big challenges across the energy system, whether that's from a technical perspective, analysis and pathway planning, policy and regulation, and working with different groups across the energy system. So everything from kind of community organisations through local authorities, networks, developers, and policy experts. And we are a membership organisation. So our membership is really reflective of this. And several of you are on the session today. So welcome to you all. This broad membership is really fortunate when it comes to something like exploring the regional energy strategic plan policy framework, because it really does impact several of those groups that are involved in the energy system. And it means that by being able to work with them, we can really approach something like this new idea around the RESPs from lots and lots of different angles. So if I, again, jump over to the next slide. So as I said, we've been really fortunate to work and build our understanding of the RESP from very different angles. So these are just 4 examples of some of the projects we've been doing in this space. Starting from the top left, we've got the Pride project. So this was with the West Midlands Combined Authority, NGED and Advanced Infrastructure. So this project really kind of looking at a specific regional area and trialling the innovations used with digital tools and new governance structures that understand local and regional energy planning and the information flows that can facilitate this. Below that, we have the work that we did with the ENA and all of the distribution network operators. So digging into the details of the RESP from a wider network perspective and understanding kind of existing DNO practices and what the RESP can learn from those and how they can kind of feed each other. In the middle here is one of the most recent pieces of work that Regen's been doing, and this is as part of the Innovate UK Net Zero Living programme. So this is working with 52 local authorities across the UK and engaging these authorities about the RESPs, really giving us the perspective of organisations from across the UK, so different places, authorities in different tiers of government, and in particular those at different stages of their net zero journey and what this might mean for them. And then finally, on the right-hand side, this is our roadmap to RESP paper that we did in collaboration with SSEN. And this was a really good opportunity to test some of the broader thinking that we've been doing about the RESP, not just thinking about what it ultimately will be, but what its kind of first iterations are going to be and how we get from where we are now to the first stages of the RESP and through to kind of what it ultimately will be. So across all this as well, we've been really engaged with Ofgem and NESO. So just want to thank them for kind of the collaboration that they've offered to date and how it's really helped to shape where we are. So the vast majority of people that we spoke to across all of this engagement is really clear how positively the energy system and local authorities and local government have reacted to the announcement of the RESP. We think it's offering a really positive opportunity for places to have a greater say in network development processes and be better aligned on those shared goals for net zero. I think the second thing that we also all agree is that the challenge is going to be in the detail and agreeing that detailed design that works in specific places with specific people and ultimately works with the energy system. So as part of our RESP response, Regen is writing 2 responses. One is on behalf of the Net Zero Living programme as the voice of local authorities, and one is on behalf of Regen and our members and wider stakeholders. And in several cases, our engagement has come to quite similar conclusions about kind of some of the principles around the detailed design. So just to give you a really high level of those, because I do want to get into the content of today's session. But really some of the big things that we'd like to see from the RESP is that the understanding of local energy planning data, spatial data, and how that data is used in energy planning systems. This is a complete change around, I think, from how some of the planning is done at the moment, and making sure that those data processes are really clear, really straightforward, and not reinventing the wheel. There's also a lot of really good data practice out there. So understanding how the RESP can build on what some of the networks already do, whether that's through their DFES process or local authority engagement. And yeah, just understanding kind of the new innovations as well around data, digitalization and tools that can really help streamline that process as well for local authorities. One of our other big asks is that the RESP recognises that local authorities plan with much more than just an energy systems hat on. So local authorities, when they're planning, are trying to understand how it's going to impact economic growth, social value, and demographic shifts across a region. So again, what we want is to make sure that the RESP reflects that nuance and adds a just transition lens to its guiding principles and how kind of it sees the energy system and how it sees strategic planning. Also kind of recognising that local authorities are very resource poor at the moment, and there's a lack of statutory functions for local authorities in this space. So making sure that they are empowered to engage with this process, and also recognising the nuances between regions and how that's going to affect the makeup of things like the strategic boards. And then finally, our last sort of big ask is around getting started. So we are very aware that the electricity network RIIO-ED3 processes are going to begin next year, and that some of the gas processes have already begun. So our final kind of big ask or big need is that what can be accelerated as part of this RESP process. So the consultation response is due in October. And then we understand that Ofgem and NESO are looking to make some really fast decisions about this. So thinking about how we can get things like the strategic boards set up, really quickly so that they can at least be part of the energy planning processes in the absence of the first iteration of what the RESPs are going to be. So with that, let's get into what our agenda is going to be for today. We've got 20 minutes with Fiona Campbell from Ofgem. So Fiona's going to present for around 10 minutes, and then we're going to do a Q&A. So on that, with housekeeping, please do use the Q&A function to ask questions. If you think someone's asked a really great question, then you can also upvote that question just to make sure that we can see it and that we get to it. If you are really unfamiliar with Zoom, then the chat function is also there as well for you to use. So we're going to open with Fiona. Fraser Stewart from Regen is then going to go through one of the papers I just described, which is the roadmap to RESP and our thinking there. And then we have a panel discussion. And our panel today is Cheryl Hiles from the West Midlands Combined Authority, Clotilde, apologies, it's very small on my screen.
Clotilde Cantigrail.
Cantigrail, apologies, Clotilde, from SSEN, and then Andrew Richmond, who's from the Local Government Association. So again, the panel will be a good opportunity for you to ask your questions to three people who are very, very engaged and involved in the RESP development today. So Fiona, if I hand over to you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Molly. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Regen, for hosting the webinar and having me along to present on the RESP framework. I'm Fiona Campbell. I head up the local governance policy team at Ofgem, so responsible overall for the development of RESPs as well as wider local governance reform. So if we move to the next slide, I'll just briefly set the RESP in the context of its policy journey. So and apologies, I'm going to start with context that is even before this slide, the timeline on the slide. So the RESP really sort of is part of a broader paradigm of kind of a couple of things that go in tandem. One, a move across the energy system overall to get the right governance and institutions in place. And then secondly, as a result of that, a move towards much more strategic planning. So we launched our local governance reform in April of 2022. And this was looking at key functions for distribution system operation, so energy system planning, market facilitation of flexibility services and real-time ops, and looking at whether the governance arrangements were right for ultimately for delivering a net zero system and that transition to a more smart and flexible system and how that changes those functions. I set this in the context of NESO because this governance reform was happening in the wake of us making a decision to move towards an independent system operator, and therefore there was a need to question whether we had the right arrangements in place at a subnational level now that we were reforming national level. Through the governance reform call for input, the subsequent consultation, we found that there were governance issues that were specific to each of the functions that we were looking at within our scope. And for energy system planning, we found that whilst there is a lot of good practice ongoing, the governance itself is not delivering the right outcomes because of a few specific issues. Firstly, there's a lack of accountability at a subnational level, so at a distribution level of the system, for a whole energy system view which is strategic in nature. At the moment, we only have actors doing energy system planning that either have a single vector view or are not integrated in the energy system landscape. So there's that lack of accountability. And then amongst those many different actors, we think there's insufficient coordination. Whilst there's lots of collaboration between actors, and that's been really successful at driving some enhanced planning and outcomes, we don't think that that is sufficiently coordinated with a clear point of accountability or common objective driving it. And then linked to that, there's a very inconsistent landscape right now. We've got different approaches happening around all parts of the country. And as a result, all of those factors come together to mean that we can't have the strategic approach to planning that we need to be able to enable net zero. So that case for change has emerged through these various different reform steps. And where we're at today is we're in the consultation period for the RESP policy framework. We confirmed our intention to introduce RESPs in November of last year. And so this policy framework is now looking at the really detailed policy design of what that framework should entail. The purpose of the framework is that it sets out really clear guidance and expectations for the methodology that NESO will develop for delivering RESPs, so the methodology of the plan, as well as some of the other things around the side of it that broadly come in the operating model of how it's delivered. So in terms of what this consultation is about, it's really about giving a clear steer to NESO of how they create RESPs. So if we move on to the next slide, just to articulate a bit more about the vision, I've set out some of the challenges we see in the system right now. Our vision is that regional energy system planning needs to be fully whole system, and that should lead to a coordinated development of the system across multiple vectors. And crucially, that place-based understanding is central to that. We think it's critical that energy system planning becomes much more integrated and aligned with local and spatial planning, because especially at a distribution level of the system, so many of the changes that will happen and will drive energy infrastructure investments are going to be highly place specific and dependent on a combination of factors that without that understanding, we won't be able to make that investment with confidence. So ultimately, this is all about delivering network investment with confidence, making sure it's made when and where it's needed, and that we drive forward decarbonisation at pace. To capture that vision, we've set out 4 principles in the consultation that should guide the NESO in how they develop the methodologies for RESP, but their overall delivery of them also. Firstly, that they should be whole system and adopt that whole system perspective across vectors. They should be proactive and support a more proactive approach to how the energy system is developed, not waiting for just in time, but instead anticipating change and investing ahead of need. They should be vision-led. This is crucial to the coordinated development. There needs to be a long-term objective for that region that drives that coordination. And then lastly, be place-based. Make sure that that is integrated into all of the energy system approaches. We think these principles capture the broad range of the vision, but are interested within the consultation if they hit the mark and provide a really clear steer for NESO in how they develop RESPs. So on to the next slide. If we this just takes us for a little look at the RESP operating model. So before looking at what RESPs as a plan will entail, this looks at how NESO will deliver RESPs. So we expect them to deliver RESPs through a hub and spoke model. So NESO will develop a central hub RESP function, and its role will be to provide cross-regional oversight across all RESPs, supporting optimization and coherence with national level planning, as well as a regional forum to navigate trade-offs or share best practice. Crucially, they will also be a centre of technical excellence and competence and develop the RESP methodology. This will include any standard assumptions, digital tools, and set the methodology for how national level data is aggregated and how it inputs into the bottom-up data. So the central hub will develop the methodology, and then each of the regional spokes will develop the plan, the RESP itself. The purpose of the regional spokes is to bring together local and regional inputs to develop the RESPs. To support this, there will be key governance and processes in place to ensure that there's structured ways that local actors can feed in. So on the governance, we are proposing that this should be in the form of a strategic board that has oversight of RESP development and can provide a forum for transparent deliberation of regional priorities. We think that the strategic board should provide a steer on the RESP, and then NESO is the overall decision maker. We also set out that there should be working groups set up to provide legitimate processes to support that governance and that plan creation. These will provide a forum to co-create on specific elements of the plan and feed in that place-based data and insights, weigh up technical feasibility, and support any optimization. So that's a bit about how the model overall will work. If we move on to the next slide, this then just takes a look at where this model overall fits into the institutional planning landscape. So firstly, starting with strategic planning across the energy system. RESPs will be delivered by NESO, and therefore this will drive coherence with the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan and the Centralised Strategic Network Plan. And also, of course, any further outputs there are, noting the current development of Clean Power 2030. So that central hub will sit alongside the CSMP and the CEP in the NESO structure and enable that really close alignment between those strategic planning outputs. Then looking at network planning, the role of RESPs is to inform distribution network plans. So this is its primary function in terms of what it will be mandated to do, and DNOs and GDNs will have to align their network planning with the direction set by the RESP. Ofgem will then remain accountable for approving the plans and the allowances that network companies put forward. And then lastly, onto local planning. The local plans will provide a critical input into the RESP. This will both be local area energy plans, or LHEs in Scotland, but also any other spatial plans in a place or any data that is relevant. So it's not just about having LEPs feed in, but it's about getting any relevant spatial planning data and inputs fed into the process. Also, RESPs should provide a really useful output for spatial planning to use and drive that greater alignment across the two spheres of planning. So that's how it all fits together on the institutional and planning landscape. If we can go on to the next slide. So now just to then give an overview of the proposals specifically on what are the building blocks of the RESP and the specific regional governance and boundaries proposals. So for the RESP, we set out 3 areas that we think should form the key building blocks of what is a RESP plan. And apologies for sort of repeating the P in the acronym there, but just to make the point that this is about the form of that plan that will be created for each region. So there'll be 3 elements of it. And all of this is about setting strategic direction. The RESP should do that through modelling supply and demand. And critically, we propose that this should be bounded by a regional objective. So there should be a long-term objective for each place, and then a set of modelled pathways that align to that objective that show how energy needs will evolve in that place. The RESP should then identify system need and set the foundations for that network planning to happen from. So they don't do the detailed network planning, but they show where there's going to be hotspots of system need, either through setting that out spatially or informing areas of strategic investment. And then lastly, the RESP should also ensure there's a forum for technical coordination. So in areas of great whole system challenge or cross-vector challenge, the RESP will provide a clear steer on how that challenge should be navigated within the plan. For regional governance, I've covered some of this to an extent, but just to highlight that the strategic board will be that forum to provide steer, and we propose that it's formed of both network companies, local democratic representatives, so local government, devolved government, whatever is the right sort of tier depending on the specifics of the place, and then any other wider cross-sector representation that is suitable to that area. And then lastly, for boundaries, we propose 11 regions in total. For Scotland, we propose 1 region. For Wales, we're also going for 1 region, but this isn't an area of consultation, as this was already sufficiently consulted on previously. And for England, we propose a model which is adapted from previous proposals and takes areas from strategic transport bodies as well as ITL1 models. So all in all, that provides 11 regions, but we do provide an alternative option in the consultation. So they're the key proposals in scope. I'm mindful of time, so I might suggest that we just skip over the last slide and move on to the next step slide. So that's given you an overview of some of the context and the key proposals in scope of the RESP consultation. It's open until 8th of October. So as Molly said, there's a couple of responses coming in from Regen, but for anyone who isn't yet planning to put a response in and wants to off the back of today, there's still time, hopefully, and do get in touch with us if there's any challenges for that. The responses will help us in shaping the policy framework, and we aim to publish a decision on this in winter 2024 or early 2025. To pick up, though, on the point that Molly made around pace, we hope that we can start to give really clear steers to NESO to guide their methodology development setup alongside the development of the decision so that we can move this forward as pacey as possible. And to that, we're aiming for the first RESP output to be produced by early 2026 to support the setting of the electricity distribution price control. So I'll finish off there and take any questions, and there's our email address if you want to get in touch for further information.
Thank you, Fiona. There's a good question in the chat actually, which I think speaks to that first point you made on the three on the building blocks of the RESP and what's going to be in it. So the question's around hydrogen, and it sort of says presumably it's only linked to energy storage and transport, as a lot of places have already ruled out hydrogen for heating. So how will the RESP, particularly in that sort of very place-based model, be able to emphasize those places that, you know, really want to make that trade-off decision between hydrogen and electrification?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I think answer it in a few different ways of how RESP can help. So I think RESP can help in that navigation where there is a trade-off between hydrogen and other forms of domestic heating sources. It can help with sort of the navigation of that, where there's a conversation to be had with local. But I think the thrust of the question is more where hydrogen's been ruled out in places and deemed not effective. In that sense, the RESP will be collecting the spatial plans, the data from local authorities to understand what plans it may have in place for heat decarbonisation. In the absence of those, it will also be taking assumptions from other data sources, some sort of bottom up, such as heat pump data uptake, but also top down data to get a view of how demand might grow for heat decarbonisation and what that means for infrastructure investment. So in that sense, I think naturally it should be quite data led, and by being data led, it will go with whatever's going to be most effective, and what's integrated in that local place, which is a very fudgy way of saying I can't foresee a world where the RESP would come to a position that hydrogen should be used as a heating source if that is completely at odds with the data and the local plans that are coming forward.
Thanks, Fiona. So another one from the chat that's been upvoted a few times is around the definition of whole system, and if that includes things like community energy and those more community level and community-led initiatives, as well as the usual suspects.
Yeah, so it's a great question, one we've grappled with lots on sort of the meaning of whole system, whole energy system versus cross-vector, etc. The definition that we have sort of landed on is around whole energy system, trying to limit that this is looking at sort of energy vectors rather than whole system and into some other utilities such as water, transport, etc., albeit they should be really relevant inputs. In that guise, then, we would definitely see community energy as falling within that definition and should be part of the whole system considerations that NESO are looking at. But then there may be intricacies for them to design in the methodologies of how they look at those specific vectors.
Thank you. And then this is probably quite a nice short answer, but one from Drew Murphy, which is around how are you going to kind of keep the RESPs remaining live and relevant, given that the energy system is kind of constantly evolving and changing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think this is a key sort of rationale for why we wanted this to be delivered by NESO and through this hub and spoke model is, whilst we want to put in place that really place-based regional focus, we also want it to be consistent and maintain coherence with any ongoing developments. So an example of this right now is Clean Power 2030 as a target and as a sort of embryonic plan was not known about when we were developing the RESP policy framework, etc., consultation. But the model we've got can adapt to that changing landscape, and so it'll fall into one of those top-down inputs that the NESO will have to aggregate into any RESP methodology. So that's just an example of how using that approach to delivering it allows us to factor in changing circumstances around us in the sector.
Thank you. We'll do a couple more questions before we get into Fraser's work. So there's one in here that I think is really interesting because it's about the RESP and sort of behaviour changes. So it's how do you kind of hope or expect customers to be nudged to align their decisions with the plan? So given that local load requirements will be driven by uptake, so do you sort of expect the plans to predict customer behavior or customer behavior to dictate the plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think to an extent, to be really honest, I think some of that will play out in the methodologies. But I think in moving to that more proactive approach and investment ahead of need, we need to send a clear signal to investment, to markets, and ultimately, therefore, to what will drive consumer behaviour and the propositions that we delivered to them by how the system is evolving. So we need to make sure that how that network infrastructure is sited is as data-led as possible. So that'll be understanding plans, understanding uptake, but then there will have to be modelling and projections which guide the investment, and that's where you hope that it then sends a signal that is picked up on and that investment proves needed. But I think how we navigate that balance will be an evolving piece across all of the strategic planning outputs.
And then final question, it's one that comes up, I think, in a lot of discussions, and I think one that we'll probably revisit with our panel as well, because it's around local area energy plans, and that they're not a statutory requirement for English local authorities. They're not a statutory requirement for any local authorities, but we do understand like the Welsh Government has funded one for Wales, and in Scotland they have the LHEs, which are slightly different. But how do you expect that kind of leaps or might be developed in order for them to feed into the regional energy strategic plans, kind of based on that they're not statutory at the moment? That makes them a little bit inconsistent in the way they're developed across regions, and that a lot of local authorities are resource poor, so can't really explore the opportunity of creating one.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think there's a few ways that this is sort of addressed within the framework. So first off, just to reiterate that whilst it's critical that LEPs should feed into RESP development, that isn't the only way that any form of place-based or local data should be fed in. So in the absence of a LEP, there should still be other data sources which are helping drive that RESP creation. However, then on the creation of LEPs, I hope that by having a more structured framework of how LEPs can influence and integrate into energy system planning, that helps strengthen the case for LEPs to be made by local authorities for those that are sort of umming and ahhing on whether to. We think this provides a clearer incentive of why it could be beneficial. On the standardization and consistency, I think this is going to be a difficult one to manage. As you said at the start, we don't want to start from a blank piece of paper. There's lots of ongoing best practice, but equally to make that work as best as possible, there need to be efficiency. So we expect that to be worked on through the methodology development, and there will need to be some accommodation by NESO for that inconsistency. I guess the final thing is, I know that we're not addressing therefore the fact that they're not a statutory requirement, and there's a lot of capacity challenges. Ultimately, this is a question for government of if it should be a statutory requirement. But again, we think that this makes that governance landscape clearer to help navigate that question, albeit the RESP will provide some capacity and tools to provide some help in the absence of that.
Great, yeah, thank you, Fiona, and thank you for those answers. We're going to go now, I think, to Fraser. There are still some great questions in the Q&A, and we will try and get to them in the queue in the panel session, because some of them are relevant, or definitely relevant, to the people we've got speaking today. But for now, Fraser's going to speak a little bit about Regen's Roadmap to RESP paper.
Thank you, Molly, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. So for anyone who doesn't know, I'm Fraser. I am Regen's Just Transition lead. You might have heard me banging the drum all over LinkedIn and other social media. I head up most of our work on social, economic, citizen, community, fuel poverty, that kind of stuff. Earlier this year, myself and our head of local, Poppy Maltby, headed up this particular piece of work sponsored by SSEN, exploring how regional energy strategic planning can help unlock ambitions for different local and regional stakeholders. So for the next 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to try and squeeze in as much as I can about this work, focusing on how we arrived at our recommendations, the key messages that came out, and then we'll talk through one or two of the specifics within there. We have lots of insights, lots of recommendations in this paper that we can't get through today. So please do, if you haven't already, have a read of it. It was in the pre-read materials. So the aims of this work, there were two key things we really wanted to get out of it. The first was we wanted to explore options, solutions for regional planning that unlock value for different stakeholders, not just networks, not just local authorities, although they were key in that, but across a region, the different stakeholders who are relevant and important to the energy system to make sure that all of the work that NESO will come in and do with this regional function adds value to those processes. The second thing we wanted to do was explore what we lovingly titled interim evolutions. So understanding that RESPs won't be in place until 2026. There are lots of innovation projects happening just now, lots of other processes currently underway that can evolve to provide a more solid foundation, allowing NESO to then springboard into action when the time comes. So we did this project. You'll see on the right-hand side of the screen here our methodology. We did this project through reviewing literature and policy. We interviewed a load of stakeholders from local authorities, networks, net zero hubs, devolved government, experts, etc., to develop first some principles for regional planning, which I'll talk to in the next slide, and to develop some of those early options to take forward into a workshop. In this workshop, we had a load of different sector stakeholders: local authorities, networks, gas, electricity, distribution, transmission, devolved government, combined authority, National Infrastructure Commission, community energy, lots of different people in the room. The reason that we picked all of these different stakeholders was because regional planning will impact and be impacted by all these different groups. It also presents lots of opportunities for these different groups for collaboration, for coordination to enable new opportunities. So we wanted to make sure that we had the right people in the room to understand how regional ambition can better be unlocked, but also to try and build a little bit of consensus around the things that we were suggesting. We then refine these, put them forward in our report. Next slide, please, Han. All of the recommendations then, and all of the insights that we pulled together were built on 3 principles, which you've already heard a lot about between Fiona's presentation, Molly's presentation, and also I noticed a couple of the questions in the Q&A spoke to these as well. But these core principles were developed initially by Regen and then tested with the stakeholders to make sure that they held weight, and they are as follows. So the first principle we outlined for regional energy strategic planning is that it should build on and add value to existing processes. So processes such as network forecasting, planning and investment, local area energy planning, LHEs, combined and devolved government energy strategies, community level energy planning. All of these provide a really strong basis for NESO to build from. So rather than duplicating effort, reinventing the wheel, the RESP should aim to add value to, enhance and enable these wider local and regional processes. The second was that it needs to be transparent and collaborative. And I think if we were to revise this report, we would add accountable on the end of there as well. So data sharing, there's got to be data flying all over the shop, engagement, all of these processes. Currently, we hear from stakeholders, particularly in local authorities, a lot of the energy planning processes today feel like a bit of a black box. You engage, you send your data, it goes into the black box, and out comes the plan with no real sort of discussion in between. So we want to make sure that these processes are open and transparent, that they support strong coordination and collaboration, and that they promote democratic accountability, so we can see the decisions that are being made and influence those decisions in real time. The third principle is that it should be iterative and dynamic, and this speaks to Drew Murphy's point in the Q&A there about the fact that we live in a sort of wider energy net zero policy landscape that is probably since the election changing quickly, more quickly than it has done in recent times. So what we don't want to see here are regional energy strategic plans which are static, which, you know, you spit this plan out, it sits for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and nothing sort of changes within that time frame. We want to make sure it captures these ongoing changes through, you know, annual data refreshes, through short and long-term versions of the plan, which the consultation document speaks to. The other side of this is we also don't want it to be one directional, right? We don't want NESO to take national level energy plans, disaggregate them out to regions and local authority areas and say, there you go, guys, go and work towards this. For us, some of the core value here, arguably the core value, is embedding this democratic, bottom-up, place-based engagement element into strategic planning, and that for us needs to be the key priority to shape out regional plans which work for regional needs, circumstances, and ambitions. There's one other principle that we want to add here, and Molly touched on this at the beginning, is that in Ofgem's consultation, as Fiona highlighted before, there are 4 sort of pillars of the vision, 4 principles that make up Ofgem's sort of vision for regional energy strategic planning. We would add a 5th, and this is based on a lot of stakeholder engagement we've had both within this project and since this project, which is around the RESP or NESO in the regional energy planning function, better enabling a just transition. So at this level, we've already talked about sort of democratic input, better accountability, better designing the energy system to reflect regional and local needs. But for NESO specifically, we think that they can support a just transition in 3 key areas. The first is participation and engagement. So we've heard a lot about place-based engagement. We want to make sure that as we're thinking about that whole energy system, like we talked about before, we don't end that at the meter that sits in the cupboard under your stairs, that we're thinking about communities. We're specifically thinking about community energy, but also those disadvantaged communities, people in fuel poverty, making sure that that voice and those needs are reflected as well, so that we can enable sort of wider social value through the regional process. The second is in supporting less resource local authorities. Now, we know that NESO aren't going to provide cash monies to local authorities to deliver local energy plans, but we want to make sure that input into the regional planning process isn't only for those local authorities who have resource, who have the expertise and capacity already to deliver them. So providing support for those with the sort of least capacity at the moment, and joining that up as well with requests to make sure that resource to deliver local plans, whatever form they take, and participate in that process come forward. The third way that NESO can support a just transition with the regional planning process is to layer in distributional analysis of the whole system plans. So recently, Regen worked with SSEN on their future energy scenarios, their distribution future energy scenarios. We did some social and economic analysis to understand the types of communities where they were planning to invest in their networks and identify potential issues where some communities may be left behind, others may be sort of over-prioritised within the system, to identify just transition issues and make suggestions for redressing those. This is quite novel analysis, but it's really easy to replicate, and we would recommend that in the interest of supporting a just transition, NESO tries to take these forward. So these are our principles. We then come to our key messages out of this report. Next slide, please, Hannah. These key messages, we had 5 of them overall and some specific recommendations under each of them, but I'll talk to the messages for the time being, and if we have the time to get through 1 or 2 of the specifics, I'll get into those as well. So our first key message was that RESP provides an opportunity to support strong regional collaboration, coordination, and democratic input within energy system planning. So through this strategic convening, providing consistency and clarity in standards and processes, including planning, but also accountability, the RESP can enable effective net zero energy planning and investment that unlocks these regional ambitions and, in our view, supports a just transition as well. This democratic side, we've said it and we'll say it again, really is the sort of key component of this process. So it's not enough for it to become a purely top-down technocratic thing. It has to meaningfully work with regions to reflect their ambitions and enable progress against them. The second key message, and bearing in mind this is not just Regen's view, this is from our stakeholder engagement and research. The second key message is that processes such as network and local energy planning should continue to be evolved ahead of the RESP being in place. So the RESP will take some time to design. We're looking at 2026 for the first plans to be in place, but there are other things which can evolve and which can be put in place today to make sure that regional ambitions are at least to some degree reflected in network business plans as they're already underway and being formulated. So thinking about the things that can evolve already, providing additional consistency and assumptions around network planning in particular would be a useful starting point. We'd also recommend, as Molly mentioned, getting those strategic boards in place early, or at least some version of them. The third key message that came out of this research was that visibility and interoperability of cross-vector network, local authority, national spatial plans is key. So making sure that all these different data sets can actually work together and formulate an actual plan that's useful to people is going to be critical to supporting the strategic regional process. Visibility of these plans and strategies. And we're not just thinking about where our network's planning to invest in the network, as important as that is. We're not even only thinking about local area energy plans. We are thinking more widely about those local plans, about those devolved government plans, as Fiona mentioned. What's important here is that NESO develops a clear set of standards and assumptions to provide consistency, which they seem to have committed to doing. So standards in terms of the assumptions of the data going into these different plans, but also consistency in the spatial resolution specifically, so that all these things can be overlaid and mapped together is going to be critical. But I think what's also important here when we talk about the sort of visibility and the accountability that we've been talking about before is that we don't just produce a plan and then everyone says, that's great, thanks for producing this plan. But there's a clear mechanism in place to make sure that that's followed through, particularly where the democratic element, the strategic board and working groups have informed the direction of a region fed through those ambitions to make sure that everyone's pulling in the same direction within reason. The penultimate key message was that dynamic and transparent processes will be critical to unlocking this full value. So we mentioned this in our principles, highlighting that network and regional energy planning should provide frequent and open opportunities for input into planning activities, but also a clear communication of how decisions are being arrived at, how regional ambitions are being incorporated, and where there's scope for this to go further. We'd also like to see some kind of sort of monitoring, progress and monitoring mechanism within that, so we can understand how everyone is moving in that direction and things that still need to be done. And then the final point is around our strategic boards. So this primary advantage of democratic input and accountability is critical. A board of regionally significant stakeholders, including elected officials, also networks, other significant stakeholders, can really help to drive regional progress. And we're glad to see, bear in mind, this report was done before this version of the consultation. So we're glad to see this embedded in the consultation today. But what we want to see now is boards put in place sooner rather than later to help develop that first sort of high-level regional vision, influence key processes, but also to start working towards those working groups to make sure that, as we talked about before, those potentially excluded or less expert stakeholders, such as fuel poverty charities, but also more local specific organisations like community energy, are also brought in to influence this first version, which is likely to, or we hope, will strongly influence network business plans. I'm checking my time and I appreciate that the session's running over a little bit. So Molly, I might give way to get the panelists in. But if you want to hear more about it, read the report, give me a shout. Let's talk.
That's great. Thank you, Fraser. If anyone does have any questions related to that during the panel session, we can fling a question or two over to Fraser as well. But in the meantime, let's bring our wonderful panel in. Great, thank you. So just as a reminder, we're joined by Clotilde Cantegrill from SSEN, Cheryl Hydes from Energy Capital, which is part of the energy function of the West Midlands Combined Authority, and Andrew Richmond, who is part of the Energy and Environment team at the Local Government Association. So what I'd like to do is ask you all to introduce yourselves with kind of, who you are, what kind of work you've been doing that's around the RESP, but also when you're doing that, I'd like you to answer the question, which is, what do you think, or, for your organization, what is going to be the most impactful change that the RESPs bring about? And then everyone in the audience, when they are describing what that is, hopefully that will prompt some questions from you as well. So if we start with Cheryl.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks for having me. Lovely to see you all. So I'm Cheryl Hars. I'm Director of Energy Capital at the West Midlands Combined Authority. We've been working with Regen actually on one of the projects that Molly mentioned earlier called Project Pride, which is about planning regional infrastructure in a digital environment and looking at how specifically around the energy governance element and how we can test different types of models and see who needs to be involved in what hopefully will become these new boards that the RESP function is proposing. Previous to that, we were working specifically on a project called the Regional Energy Systems Operator, which has fed into some of the evidence that explains why there are real benefits to planning and running the energy system with consideration of sort of regional plans and regional operations. So that provided some of the evidence that I think has helped feed into the decision making of Ofgem. So we've been quite heavily involved for quite some time. In terms of answering your question, Molly, for us, the key thing that was mentioned by Fee was around whole energy system considerations, because when you come from a place perspective, you don't think in silos. You think from a place perspective and you want to understand how everything comes together. We want to be able to make decisions on what type of infrastructure should go where and help reduce risk for investors so that they can actually move in knowing that they're bringing the right sort of infrastructure to meet the needs of the place. So that's the key thing for us, where we hopefully we'll start to see this the energy system being an enabler of what we want to achieve locally. And critically, another thing that was mentioned by Fia earlier was about the incentive for local energy planning and for people to come together and actually feed into something. So actually having our voice heard and by setting a mechanism that can actually respond to places, hopefully going to be really powerful from our perspective.
Thanks, Cheryl. We'll go over to Andrew with the same question.
Great. Thank you very much, Molly, and thank you for inviting me here as well today. I'm Andrew Richmond. I'm Policy Advisor for Climate Change and Growth at the Local Government Association. We're a membership organisation. We've got all but 2 members, English councils in our membership, and really that makes us a strong voice for local councils and local government in England. We've been interested and following the RESP progress for the last kind of 12 months. We recently had Ofgem come to our local infrastructure and net zero board back in February. That really kick-started the conversation off and engaging with our members on the opportunity that the RESPs are going to bring to local government and local placemaking, but also some of the challenges that were identified with that early stage. What do I think is going to be the most impactful change that the REFs are going to make? Is that democratic accountability. I think it brings in placemaking both locally, regionally, and democratically. It brings those stages together in an informative viewed position. And I think what local government is experiencing quite a bit is a bit of inconsistency in being able to engage in the energy system at the moment. And the RESP process will bring some equality across of that engagement opportunity across the nation, and it will enable each local authority to engage with energy system planning, whether they've got a local area energy plan or not, in an informative and formative manner.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And then Clotilde, we'll go over to you.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. So my name's Clotilde. I'm head of strategy for SSEN distribution. And at SSEN distribution, over the last year or so, we've really sort of been overhauling our network and system planning process so that we can take a much kind of longer term view into 2050 of the needs on our network. And that's enabling us to work more closely with our local communities, our local authorities, to have a really kind of strategic view of what's happening. And that centres around what we're calling strategic development plans. At the same time, we've also got a lot of work going on through our Lender tool, which again is all about accelerating net zero at the local level. So we're really interested in the RESP piece, actually. And to answer your question, we think there's a lot that the RESP can add to our existing processes and all the work that we are currently doing. I think the first thing for me is that it really puts the needs of the local grids in focus. I think there's a lot of discussion around transmission and sort of the national debate, but actually we think we need to be having that discussion at the distribution level. So it's fantastic that we're here today at this webinar doing just that. I think building on some of what Andrew and Cheryl have said as well, I think that longer term strategic view is really critical, but even more important for us is that it needs to be democratically driven and it needs to be whole system. And that will help us then understand exactly what needs to go into our strategic development plans and what actually is needed on our network into 2050. And it will drive that dialogue for us. So really important. And I think the rest can really play that convener role, making sure all the different voices are heard. And then I think that the last point I'd make really is around that alignment, top down and bottom up, because obviously it's very important that we deliver kind of on our overarching net zero target. Local community ambitions are really important to that, but we need to be able to understand what the picture looks like at the national level and how the two align. So that's where I think we could see some real benefits from the RESP model.
Thank you. So you've all mentioned the idea of democratic accountability within that. We got a really interesting question in the chat that I think I'm going to hand over to Cheryl because of the work that you've been doing in Pride around the governance and bringing those voices into the RESP decision-making process. So obviously, as well as local authorities, how do you envision different stakeholders and how different stakeholders could be weighed in terms of their say on the decision? So other parties like industry, non-network energy companies or aggregators, and how are you exploring kind of those governance systems that help make sure their voices are reflected?
Thanks, Molly. So I think it might be slightly different in each region, just to say. So wherever you are, I would suggest you do engage with the different parties involved. But what we've been doing in the West Midlands and what it's showing us is that the model that's being suggested by the RESP function looks like it will work quite well with a strategic board, but under that having working groups that are feeding into that. So what we have done is set up what we called a net zero infrastructure delivery panel, which was the infrastructure investors, different types of infrastructure investors. And we also had a local authority group who are coordinating all the local energy plans that are going on in the region. So we had sort of two groups, and the local authorities were represented on that infrastructure group. So that's how we sort of started the governance model. We then explored how we would bring those other voices in, because as the question asks, it's really important to hear those the different perspectives from lots of different areas, and the local authorities don't always have that information. So we're going to be looking at setting up customer groups, or not necessarily setting them up, but trying to find where those customer voices can come in. So around industry as an example, we're not going to get industry coming and sitting and talking to us. We have quite heavy industry in the West Midlands, but they're all small, medium size enterprises. They don't have the capacity to come and engage every day. But there are parties who work with them regularly, who know what their investment needs are, whether they're going to require hydrogen, whether electrification is going to work, what sort of timescales they're working on, all those kinds of things. And it's bringing that information in through sort of customer groups, which could be replicated in sort of similar working groups under the RESP model, and making sure also that information can be brought in in a sort of confidential manner, so that it can inform the planning process without compromising anybody's sort of commercial situation. And that can apply for across the board, transport, community, energy, across the whole perspective. So there's lots of different ways of bringing that information in, but I think the structure is flexible enough that's proposed at the moment to be able to make that work for your area.
Thanks, Cheryl. Andrew, I'm going to come over to you with a question. So thinking about that accountability and how to balance the sort of the technical needs to engage with the RESP with sort of the more political accountability side of a local authority, and what sort of questions and discussions you've been having sort of as an LGA level about that.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much. Kind of Cheryl alluded to, local government varies across England reasonably quite significantly, and especially at that kind of regional level. So you've got a number of mayoral combined authorities working very closely with their councils, with their district councils within that area. You've got other areas that are more disparate. You've got large county council areas and numerous district councils operating and delivering lots of the planning functions. And also the housing provision functions of local government. So I think what's going to be kind of challenging is making sure that the RESP function represents the local area within that local area. So I think the key point when NESO gets handed over the RESPs is really NESO engaging with the local areas to understand what the needs of that local area are, where the representation kind of sits within that area, and making sure that that's represented on the strategic boards, in the working groups, and that is balanced, and the democratic accountability kind of comes through in that sense at those levels, because it is going to have to be, I think it's going to, our response is going to be, you need to look at this from a local perspective, because areas are different. And if you want proper democratic accountability and you want full opportunity and engagement with local government, it will have to be kind of decided at that RESP level.
Great, thank you. Clotilde, I'm going to come over to you. We've had a couple of questions from kind of the developer perspective. So how do you see, everything in the energy system is intertwined, and there's a lot happening as well in the connections process. How do you expect the sort of the RESPs to interact with, what is currently a changing connections process?
Yeah, so at the moment, we've obviously got a whole lot of work that's going on the connections reform side of things. And then we've also got this work stream looking at regional energy strategic planning. And I think certainly from our perspective, we do see that the two would and should eventually converge. Now, that's probably not going to happen overnight, but we do think that kind of the two should ultimately come together. And I think from our perspective, there's a couple of points to make, really. I think Fiona outlined earlier that the concept of regional objectives, and I think that's going to be quite critical in terms of driving what is happening in a particular region. So that's going to be, I think the first piece. I think the second piece is going to be that alignment that I mentioned, sort of top down with the SSEP, with that kind of overarching picture, so that we've got a real understanding around what do we actually need across the entire GB to really meet our net zero targets, and making sure that we've got the right investments happening at the right time. So I think that there's going to be a critical role for that regional objective piece, and also for that alignment in SSEP in terms of longer term bringing in connections and strategic planning together. I think one of the things as well that we explored through the Roadmap to RESP report is this concept of an in-development register. Now, I don't kind of love that term. I think we need to find a better term for it, but I think that possibly reflects that actually through the RESP, we need to gain a better understanding of all of the things that are potentially going to happen on our network. We've done a lot of work in the Scottish Islands, in our northern patch, to look at some of the industries that are looking to decarbonise that wouldn't necessarily have been captured through things like LEAPs or through other types of engagements, but do have plans to strategically decarbonise. And I think there's a bit of a gap there that actually shorter term we should be trying to fill with the rest. So I think in the longer term, where I see this going is that the two effectively converging. But I think what this also means is that actually we're going to be able to unlock greater capacity for everyone and hopefully avoid some of the connections challenges that we're facing at the moment. And I think that is for me the longer term game. And I think that's be a win across the piece.
Thanks, Clotilde. And I'm going to follow straight back up to you with another question. Because
yes, go for it.
It's one that's been asked in the chat about how will the interests of island communities be represented? So obviously SSEN serves those islands communities with the energy network, and understand that there's already quite a bit of work that happens between SSEN and those communities because they are so unique. So how do you expect them to be brought into the RESP process? And is there anything that the RESP can learn from some of the work that SSEN's been doing about engaging those communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing I would say is, as you mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work with our communities on the Scottish Islands. I mentioned some of the reports that Regen have also been involved in that really look at the kind of the strategic needs of those communities, of those industries that are kind of creating jobs on those communities as well. And that work is going to continue. So I think we see the RESP as being additive to all the work that's already going on. So certainly from our point of view, we would expect the level of engagement that we are having to continue. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing I would flag is that LEPs, LHEs should play a really critical role in RESP. I think they are a critical input into the RESP process, and so I would expect that to be kind of another piece or another opportunity to make sure that those local communities and their voices have heard. And I think the final point probably comes back a little bit to some of what you were saying, Andrew, which is actually every area is different, and how the governance is going to work in practice, I imagine, will be very different in our southern patch to our northern patch. And so I think it's really important that the RESP or the NESO, as it's developing the RESP, works really closely with those local communities, but also with us as DNOs. We have been building up some of those relationships already to kind of really understand how we can make this work in practice. So in the context of Scotland specifically, Ofgem's consultation, I think, proposes a single region, but potentially also looks at 2 regions. I think we have been fairly agnostic in the sense that actually, if it's 1 or 2 regions, you probably still face some similar challenges in terms of really making sure everybody's voices are heard. So I think that's going to be the critical element. And I was quite interested, Cheryl, in some of the working group type examples that you were given, because there's the board, but I think it's also about how we really make use of some of those working groups. That's going to be really critical. So I don't have a very firm answer, but I think a lot of what we're doing already is going to help and is going to continue. We've got LHEs, LEPs, etc. All those kinds of processes are going to make sure that those plans are fed in, and we're very happy to work with NESO colleagues and with our local communities in the north of Scotland specifically to make sure that the arrangements are fit for purpose in that context.
Thanks, Clotilde. We've had a question just come into the chat that I'm going to drag Fraser back to kind of give a view on it and then ask any of the panelists if they want to build on that question. So Fraser mentioned that he is our kind of head lead on just transition, so has done a lot of thinking around this question. So it's the one from Ellie in the chat, but it's around how can the voices of energy poor or vulnerable communities be meaningfully represented in the RESP process. And obviously we're talking a lot about democratic accountability, but how are we also making sure that this reflects those that are underrepresented by that? So I'm going to ask Fraser to put forward an answer, and then any one of the panel can then kind of put forward their perspective and build on it after that.
Yeah, thanks, Molly, and thanks, Ellie, for the question. I think it's a critical question to all of this. I would say there are a couple of ways that this can happen. So the first, if we think about what NESO or what Ofgem have already said the RESP will do, that kind of strategic board and working group level, particularly working groups are a great opportunity to include, for instance, advocacy organisations like fuel poverty charities. We would argue, or I would argue personally, that each RESP region should have a working group on this issue specifically, whether that's just transition, broadly speaking, or on the specific components around it, such as fuel poverty, sort of industry and skills, etc., etc. But in terms of actually bringing those voices through, we haven't heard any suggestion, that there might be a citizens' assembly to go alongside this, whether regional or at the central level of NESO, which might be an interesting way to do it. In terms of bringing those voices through, something that the consultation does outline is that there will be direct sort of training and support for organisations to be able to engage, specifically less technical organisations. So within that, we'd absolutely recommend that sort of charities working in vulnerability, third sector, community level organisations are brought within that process, so that when they do come into working groups or on a strategic board or engage in these discussions, they're doing so on an even footing, and it's not just being dominated by those organisations with the technical expertise, whose technical expertise will obviously be important within this. There are some other channels as well, I guess. We might think of these as secondary channels. So local authorities already do a ton of engagement with, to varying degrees of success, no offence, with their sort of charities and third sector and communities on the ground. So there will be an avenue via local area energy planning and local authorities. Networks also have their independent stakeholder groups. They have sort of different groups specific to questions like vulnerability. So there will be sort of, let's say, more holistic channels in, but we would certainly like to see those more direct channels with that direct support and proactive support and inclusion opened up as far as possible.
Cheryl?
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, I agree with what Fraser said. Just adding on to that, I think it's worth bearing in mind that from a local authority's perspective, the primary reason for getting involved in the energy system is around the just transition. It's also around economic growth and some of those benefits, but actually the just transition is the thing that we're trying to make sure happens. Otherwise, the market would do it itself, and we wouldn't necessarily need to intervene from a social point of view. So most local authorities and combined authorities have things like citizens' assemblies that are part of what they do, so they can be used. They don't necessarily need a separate one for the RESP function. We can harness the ones we have and access that. But I just wanted to pick up on something that I think there was another question asking sort of what government was doing about the concerns about price rises over the winter. And there are sort of two things you can do. You can obviously deal with a big issue, which I won't touch on, which is the sort of decoupling gas and electricity prices. But the other issue is to make people's homes warmer and more comfortable, and get retrofit actually working. And government has just announced plans for their warm homes local grants that are available now. And what we will see through the RESP function is that where government, local government is focusing on supporting those vulnerable households and targeting the funding that's available from government into specific areas, we'll be able to make sure that that is fed into the RESP, and the plan actually knows where these things are happening, and therefore we can make sure that the energy infrastructure is not going to be a barrier to achieving that, because sometimes that can be the case. So I think, again, opening up those different elements, making it whole systems, will ensure that we get the objective that supports that just transition, which is sort of where most of the public sector are focused.
Can I come in as well on that point?
Absolutely.
If that's all right, Molly. Just actually building on your point, Cheryl, we've been doing some work. We've got an innovation project that's actually been looking at vulnerability future energy scenarios, and it's exactly to do what you're talking about there, Cheryl, which is really recognizing that actually network planning has a massive impact potentially on vulnerability. And so our VFAS is what we call it, really looks at kind of the potential impact of investment, or the opportunities that investment could create in more vulnerable or lower income areas. So that information is available on our website. If anybody wants any more information on that, then please just give me a shout.
That's Clotilde, and then Andrew can close off on the answer for that question.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, councils are doing a lot of thinking about just transition with the energy system. There's some very good examples of just transition strategies. Newham Council has published, I think they published the first Just Transition strategy from a local council, and I know a number are now really looking at this. I think one of the big challenges is, and I think, like Cheryl said, there's a number of things you can do to reduce the number of people in fuel poverty, and one of them is around fabric energy efficiency. But I think one of the big challenges still with government is there are too many pots around, and it makes it very difficult for local government to bid into these various pots. I think bringing the investment together in one area where you can easily look at either allocating or going into partnership with local authorities, and I think there are some very good, very warm words coming from government at the moment about partnership approaches to homes retrofit. But yeah, the quicker we can get homes retrofitted, the more people will lift out of fuel poverty.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'm going to stay with you for the next question, which is, again, sort of thinking about the democratic input. What's kind of been the view of the LGA through its engagement with its members around the sort of the suggested tiered approach for the input from working groups and stakeholders? So kind of the representation of different tiers of local authorities at the strategic board level, and then the working groups level.
Well, this was kind of the bit I was alluding to earlier on. I think it really it depends on the area you're talking about, where you've got a number of borough combined authorities that have got very strong relationships with the districts and the boroughs within that area. Then I think there is an opportunity to speak with more of one voice. I think in other areas, there's less of an opportunity to speak with one voice. And I think that's where it needs to be looked at locally, negotiated locally, who's best representative on that. I think the problem I have with tier one is that your district councils, where you've got a county district arrangement, your district councils are the local planning authorities. They're producing the local plan. They are providing the housing. They are generating a lot of the demand, doing a lot of the place making. But if you went for a tier one representation on that board, you've got a county council representative who are the transport authority, are the waste disposal authority, lots of demand for energy use, and some bigger, larger industrial pieces, but not as focused on the placemaking. And that's why where you've got that two-tier system, I think the conversations, NESO needs to have the conversation locally to see what fits, what works for that area, to get that full democratic accountability, but also that strong placemaking aspect. That there's such an opportunity for the local authority placemaking consideration to be brought into energy planning.
Thank you. And Cheryl, I'm going to ask your view on that as well, obviously from someone that's within a combined authority. What's your engagement around this area been?
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, I would agree with Andrew that there needs to be specific consultation in relation to each area. I think to start with, our view was that we would be able to kind of collectively bring the places together and feed through, and whatever representation, say we were allowed one space on the board or whatever, we would be able to make it work. But that is possibly because, as Andrew said, in our area we're lucky enough that people are working collaboratively. So we're not just working in the combined authority geography. We've opened up and brought in all of the local authorities surrounding the West Midlands Combined Authority geography to form the whole RESP area. So we're trying to respond to the RESP consultation as a group. It'll be the first time that we've worked together in that way, but that's what we're trying to achieve. The way that the consultation's worded at the moment would suggest that there would be one representative from the combined authority, and then each of the local authorities would have the counties would have a representative. Now, if you think about that from a democratic accountability perspective, that means the biggest geography that covers 7 Met areas only has 1 rep, and all of the rural areas have a lot louder voice. So that it sort of goes against the argument that some make about the kind of rural areas being more left out. But actually the current model doesn't work. So what's being proposed doesn't work at the moment. So we do have to have that question asked, and I think it needs to be asked locally of the democratic representatives to say what works in your area and what can you agree. Now, if everybody can come together and agree, we'll send the mayor forward and he will represent the whole area. Great, that's fine, but that's unlikely. I think it needs to be much more detailed conversation after this round of consultation.
That's great, and yeah, I think some of the work we've been doing has definitely highlighted that discrepancy between population size and representation at strategic board level. Clotilde, I'm going to come over to you on the question, which is around thinking about the RESP workstream and NESO and how it all might tie in with the Clean Power 2030 Act. Obviously, it's all a combination of policy, politics, energy system planning. But I want to hand that one over to you, and then obviously Cheryl, Andrew, if you've got any views, please jump in afterwards.
So absolutely. So I think we touched on this briefly earlier, but there is a lot of change going on at the moment, right? We have a new government, we have Clean Power 2030, we've got the National Infrastructure Commission currently doing a review of electricity networks. There's a lot of change currently afoot, and I think it's really critical that the RESP model kind of enables us to reflect that. I think on Clean Power 2030 specifically, I think obviously that's going to be that's mainly looking at generation. So that I think there's an element of looking at demand, but it's mainly focused on generation. But we think that will have an impact definitely on us as a distribution network. Potentially will have an impact on our kind of connections queue, etc., etc. So I think lots of change afoot, and I think the most important thing actually is really setting up RESP in a way that it can be flexible. So you might then get into kind of a conversation around the timings of the RESP. So is a 3-year kind of full RESP process the right thing with an annual refresh? I think it's really critical that actually in the world that we operate in, and to the question that we had earlier around keeping things relevant, it's really about setting the RESP up in the way that is flexible, that it can continuously kind of reflect those changes. And I think for us as a distribution network operator, it's about striking the right balance between being able to kind of plan ahead and having sufficient certainty, but also again having the flexibility in the regulatory framework to reflect any changes that might come away, like CP 2030. But that is just one example, I suppose, of what we might see coming down the line from our perspective.
Great, thank you very much. I've just spied the time, and so I wanted to just close off with a final question. I think we've got Ofgem on the call, and I believe some peers from NESO are in the audience. So for our 3 panel members, this is an opportunity for them to make an impassioned plea for what stages of design and the detailed design that NESO and Ofgem should be coming to them about. So I'm going to go around all of you, and I'd like you to answer what part of the detailed design can you provide the most value and the most knowledge to support the development of? And we'll start with Andrew.
Great, thank you very much. I think for me, it's the governance aspect. So it's ensuring that governance structure is fit for purpose. It's ensuring that it's flexible enough. As Clotilde said, there's a lot of change happening but to adapt to that change, and ensuring that that all democratic voices are heard without bloating the system. And I very much appreciate that the governance structure cannot be bloated, but local government is very used to governance structures, and it can certainly help to inform NESO's decision making.
Thank you. Clotilde, I'll hand that one over to you next.
Yeah, Absolutely. I mean, I think I said at the start, it's great to see so much focus on the local grids. And I think as distribution network operators, we see ourselves as sort of the experts in that local grid. So we've got kind of that real expertise at the distribution level. But also, more importantly, we've been working really closely already with our communities through our strategic development plans to really kind of understand how our network is going to change or needs to change into 2050. So I think we're really keen to work with Ofgem, with NESO, with wider colleagues to see how we can further build on that. We'd be really looking forward to maybe doing some test trials. Maybe why not? Let's see how how setting up a strategic board could work in practice, and how setting strategic objectives could work in practice. So really, just an offer actually to kind of come and work with us, and already talking to colleagues across the piece to build on some of the work that's already been going on in the distribution space.
And then Cheryl to finish us off.
Thanks, Molly. I think when you look at something from a whole systems perspective, one of the key things that Ofgem's identified is perhaps they don't have jurisdiction over everything that they know needs to be covered in order to make this whole systems planning process work. So one of the things I'd say is reiterate what Andrew said. Don't reinvent something. Come to speak to the local governance experts, because local government does local governance. That's our speciality. But also in terms of bringing people together, we have the levers to achieve some of those things at a local level. So it's really great that the energy system is sort of finally able to talk to the place, and that's key for us. The main thing I would say is in terms of working together, they already know. Project Pride gives us that huge opportunity to actually test. So that's what we're doing. We're testing a local governance structure to see if it works. We're testing to see how we can get those other voices that we've heard into that structure, and we will be feeding that into the RESP process as it develops. So watch this space, and we're very excited to see how it all works out. We'll also be working with other places to see how that can be replicated. So I will be picking up the phone to some of our colleagues on this call to see how we can make sure that we're replicating that effectively in other places and it's all applicable.
Great, lovely. Thank you all so very much for joining us and for sharing your views on those questions then. I think we managed to get through quite a lot of the questions. Obviously, some we didn't, and some we will take away and try and make sure they are put in front of Ofgem or Fiona or someone in their team. Obviously, we've got 3 minutes left, so just a reminder that Fiona and I both mentioned, but the RESP consultation is due on the 8th of October. Regen will be putting out a response, and there will be opportunities to share any more views to feed into our responses afterwards, particularly if you are a member of Regen. So Regen is a membership organisation, and the members that we have really strengthen our voice. So you do, by becoming a member, have the opportunity to have influence in policy changes. We do take steers from our members when it comes to consultation responses, as we are doing with this one, our members and wider stakeholders as we engage right across the energy system. Membership helps you stay informed as well. So there's latest insight from sector. We have regular updates, and our team has technical expertise that covers all of the energy system, and it helps connect with others in the industry. So hopefully this has been a valuable opportunity to kind of see some of the thinking that's already happening out there. And if there is anything that you wanted to tie into, please get in touch with Hannah, whose email's at the bottom there, or go to our website page. So that just leaves me to say a huge thank you for joining us today's session. A massive thank you to our speakers and to our panelists. And we hope to hear from you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.